Offshore. Widesite TV.
So, Sian, what are the limiting factors for floating offshore wind right now?
I think we'll hear quite a lot about that over the next 2 days, and it depends on the background and the position that you come from. Clearly, for floating wind to be successful, we need scale, and for that scale, we need better licensing, more sites options available, we need different policies, and then from a supply chain perspective as well, we need to be able to standardize on a design so that we can get the supply chain ready and geared up to be able to support us with local content when these fields move forward.
Interesting. So you've touched on a number of really key and critical themes there. But let me just ask you first, what are the key differences between fixed and floating in terms of building out that industrial strength?
And I think here, again, I think people will have different views. But very clearly, I think very importantly for me, it's a technology play. When you look at floating wind, it very much is a technology play. We're talking about 80% of wind in the future coming from floating wind developments. And at that point, you start to see the structures get bigger, the turbines get bigger. And it's interesting, actually, to note that even though the turbines are getting much bigger, their percentage in the total cost of a wind development actually is smaller. So it is actually the floating foundation that is one of the critical factors to get right. So the optimization of that design is something that is really important for us in terms of being able to attract the investment and deliver the scale. So for me, floating wind lends itself really well to the supply chain strengths that exist in the UK, maybe more so than fixed bottom wind did in the past.
Interesting. Chris, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think 80% of the world's wind resources are in water depths of 60 meters or greater. So I think floating wind is going to play a critical role in achieving green energy requirements to meet our energy demands, but also in terms of tackling the climate emergency that we have today. So I think that's a critical element of this. We will need floating wind at scale, and in order to achieve that scale, we will also need ambitious but achievable targets that are set. We have 1 gigawatt of floating wind by 2030 today. We should be challenging those targets. Is that enough? But also looking beyond that to set ambitious and credible targets that we can push towards. It's great to see the ring fencing of a floating wind element in the CFD pot for less advanced technologies. That's fantastic. We need to not relax and kind of push forward to ensure that we do realise those ambitions.
Yeah, so you've both mentioned supply chain. Let's talk about supply chain now. Where would you see the most fruitful areas that we need to focus our efforts?
I think we talk a lot about the energy transition, moving to net zero, and we talk about how can we transition the oil and gas supply chain to support this. Well, when you actually look at the requirements for floating offshore wind, it actually is as much about the fact that you need the oil and gas supply chain to be successful in floating wind. So it is about the optimization of design, it's the reducing of risk, it's using designs that can actually springboard the growth of floating wind. And really, a huge part of this is in oil and gas, they've spent decades trying to optimize the life of field operating costs with remote technologies, digital tools, further automation. This is going to be a huge benefit to the offshore floating wind industry, as it scales up. So for me, I think a lot of it is the skills that you see that have come from other industries, either here in the UK or locally in other countries. And then one of the challenges we have with floating wind is also about the fact that we need to be able to standardize so that we can actually manufacture at scale. A lot of those skills come from a different supply chain that exists in the local countries. So I can see a lot of areas where we need to be really thoughtful about which skills we need and how do we access those. But they are there. Very few new skills need to be introduced. They simply need to be adapted and moved forward for a different industry.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think one other element just to consider is commitment for the supply chain. It's very difficult in piecemeal fashion for supply chain to really put in place manufacturing processes or operations that are fit for purpose based on scale. So if that scale is not committed, and that requires collaboration across all developers, and it requires policies to be in place to support the commitment to that scale. So I think that's a really key element for supply chain to be able to move early. Otherwise, there will be this kind of piecemeal back and forth and boom and bust that we definitely don't want to see in the supply chain in offshore wind.
Yeah, and I know that's something you've spoken about before in the past, Sian. So let's talk about that. So what, in terms of instilling confidence in the supply chain, do we need a different model?
I think Chris has touched on it to an extent as well, in terms of, part of the model, which is very different to how fixed bottom wind evolved, which was a very procurement-led, commoditized approach. I think here we need to start standardizing on designs such that we can engage the supply chain early. We also need the government to step in and make investment early in the supply chain so that they can be ready to compete when these projects kick off at any form of scale. And then the other one is when you actually look at the option leases, the prices that people are bidding, you really need for these fields to be developed quite swiftly after you get the consent. And that is a different model. There it's more about collaboration between the technology providers, the service providers and the wind developers. So I see a very different commercial model also emerging, more of a partnership and a relationship, as Chris said, as we go forward.
Yeah, I think the word collaboration, we say it a lot. I think it's really important in offshore wind in particular, because what we're trying to achieve is so huge. And yes, we've done that before in the energy industry, but to do it at the pace that we need to tackle the climate emergency, most importantly, I think is extremely important. So we need to see true collaboration across developers, across the supply chain, in order to realise the ambitions that we have set.
So ultimately, can we do it? Can the UK actually move quick enough to achieve first mover advantage?
Without question, absolutely. And I think the ambition that we have in the UK, the government support that we have, look at the recent ScotWind tender, the amount of bids that people have submitted for it. There's a real appetite from the investment community, from the wind developers to do it. If you look at the skill set that we've got in the supply chain here, it's fantastic. It is about how do we use that, how do we harness it. But there's no question that where you get first mover advantage, you're ahead of the technology curve, and that's a fantastic place to be. And we've got a real opportunity to be ahead of that technology curve.
I think for one, it's important to be optimistic. We have to set ambitious targets. They have to be credible targets, but those ambitious targets require optimism and require belief that we can do it. And we've done this before in the energy industry. I think that belief is key. I think we just need to make sure that when we set those ambitious targets, that they aren't just targets, that we do continue to act to make sure that we do transition from a workforce perspective, that we're able to kind of transition people and make sure that the skills are in place to deliver on what we need to deliver for this industry.
And so speaking of the future and transitioning, you're a relatively recent entrant into this sector. Tell me, what would it take for you to want to commit the rest of your career to this sector?
Having just joined Aker Offshore Wind fairly recently, it was definitely at the forefront of my mind moving across. And for me, being able to contribute to tackling the climate emergency is, one of the biggest pools. People contribute in different ways, and offshore wind is certainly not the only way to do that. But for me, with a background in energy, in the energy industry, it was an obvious choice and an easy transition. And I think, today, probably more than ever, personal purpose and values are really at the forefront of people's minds. And I think from that perspective, it's important to be able to align, from a values perspective, from a purpose perspective, to a cause that you believe in and that you think is important. And I think it's on many of our hearts and minds at the minute, the climate emergency and how we can contribute towards tackling that.
And so what do you think that we can do more generally to make the wind sector more attractive, although clearly it is attractive anyway, but more importantly, more accessible?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think, as you say, it's attractive already. It has been my kind of perception. I think visibility is one. It's very easy, personally, I find it very easy as someone in the energy industry to forget that there are, a host of talented people with relevant skills and expertise in other industries that maybe aren't fully aware of the offshore wind industry or even, how to become a part of the industry. So I think visibility is really important. That's one of the things that, I really hope to focus on at Aker Offshore Wind, is developing that visibility and putting our values and vision out there that people can grab on and join in. But also I think, it's important to distinguish between expertise and experience. For me, it's fun that in floating offshore wind, no one can really say I've built 10 floating wind farms and have lots of experience. It's new to all of us, which is really exciting, and lots of people have relevant expertise and experience. But I think it's important to make sure that experience isn't a barrier to entry for offshore wind, as we see in other industries.
So at Aker, we actually have been instrumental in over 60% of the floating units that are in existence globally today. So I think building on that expertise and bringing in new and different ideas to look at how do we standardise it, how do we take it that one step further, is that blending that's phenomenal. And that's that blending, I think, that the UK has a fairly unique position on now if we move quickly.
I just wanted to ask you one more question, actually, Sian, and it's really, what do you think we can do to make this accessible to new entrants to the sector? I mean, you've talked about skills mix, you've talked about supply chain, we've talked about what we need to do differently and if we need a different model. What's top of your wish list in terms of attracting people into the workforce?
You know, attracting people into the workforce is about giving them an enthusiasm, energising them towards a purpose. There's nothing more energising than being in at the start of a new industry and watching it climb. And also, there's an entrepreneurial spirit. You all start to pull together. It also gives people the ability to actually shine and actually climb much faster than it does in other industries where there may be more of a hierarchy already established. I don't think we're going to struggle to attract new entrants into this industry at all. I think it is a really exciting industry and it's brilliant to be in at the start of it. I think the challenge that we'll have is to be able to harness that energy and really push ourselves forward as a country.
Energy. Energy. Marine. Energy. Power. Widesite TV.